Thanks.
Okay, thank you. This paper, Preferential Trade Agreements and Global Sourcing with Grant Beckwith and John Turner. This is the first time I'm presenting the paper. It's actually a half paper, so really in progress. This was explicit when I submitted the paper. The organizer accepted. Thank you very much. It will be quite different from what has been presented here today because there is absolutely no data here. It's just we're trying to think about these two things, global sourcing and preferential trade agreements together. And so the motivation is what's going on in the world. Everybody's talking about the expansion of global value chains or global sourcing or international fragmentation of production, all that. We also know that there is a, preferential trade agreements, they are signed every, a new one is signed every month. They are exploding. And there is a general sense, especially in policy circles, but not only, that these two trends are connected. So Richard Baldwin is one that has been talking about this and advocating this for a while. In this Johnson and O'Gara, where they look at this VAX, basically how trade in intermediates have been expanding over time. The one thing that they connect very well with is PTAs. So if there is a PTA, there is a very strong correlation between more fragmentation and PTAs. So the two things, these two trends might be connected, and this is what we have here is a way to try to think about this in an organized way. So the questions we try to ask here is, how do PTAs affect the efficiency of global sourcing? And then how does global sourcing affect the welfare consequence of PTAs? Our general view here is that these, in terms of cause and consequence, the two might actually be, both might be true. Because of PTAs, you might have more sourcing in the PTA countries, and that might lead to a greater likelihood of forming a PTA in the first place. Although we don't go into trying to model that. So our approach, the initial 4 bullet points, I think these are the things that we want to, or the 3 that we want to have in the paper. I think that's important for this type of study. So incomplete contracts, trade of customized inputs, and relationship-specific investment. The partial equilibrium, that's what we have now. As you see, this is going to be as partial as it gets. It'll be useful to highlight the kind of the key forces, but the goal is to embed this in a more general framework. We'll see how that goes. We connect to this really incipient literature between global value chains, global sourcing, and PTAs. We connect to this much broader literature on the welfare impact of PTAs. Basically, we are adding another dimension to this. This, of course, is connected to the literature of trade in intermediates in the context of incomplete contracts, which Paul has basically been the main person behind. You can look at all the papers, or you can look at the Bible, which has just been out, I think, a few months ago. Not many of those papers have trade policy embedded. A few exceptions are Antras-Steger. Another one is a previous paper between me and John Turner, who is also in this paper, on which we build for this analysis. And this also connects to a sort of unrelated literature, which is the investment consequences of trade liberalization. Only that we are going to be speaking specifically about a specific context, incomplete contracts, relationship-specific investments, and PTAs. Okay, so the basic model has 3 countries. The home country will have a mass of producers or buyers, B. These guys will basically assemble final goods from inputs that are outsourced. abroad. These inputs can be bought from producers in the foreign country, which is the second country, or the third country, which is the rest of the world. The mass of suppliers in either location is large relative to the mass of the buyers in the whole market. A buyer will purchase Q units of intermediate inputs, and with that, they will produce some final good and get revenue V of Q. We are agnostic, mostly agnostic about this. V prime is positive, V2 prime is negative, but we at least for now, we're not going into the details of what's happening in the final goods market. The only thing is that the final producer needs to buy these Q units of inputs. Now, when the buyer, a specific buyer, is sourcing, he has two options of inputs. He can buy what we call standardized inputs, G, from the rest of the world at a unit cost. So this is, you can think about this as a perfectly competitive industry, has a well-defined world price, but you also have to pay a tariff, a specific tariff when you buy it. In this, so basically this generic product or input, this is produced by this competitive fringe, which doesn't really play any important role here. But the buyer also can buy customized inputs, which we call Q, from a specialized supplier S. This supplier can be either in foreign or in the rest of the world, but that's specialized, so then they have to negotiate prices and quantities individually. Each pair will have to make their own negotiations. Yeah.
So the standardized input cannot be bought from foreign? Cannot be bought from foreign?
You actually can. I mean, in this version here, you can. There's actually it's not a big issue. Yeah. I mean, we are making some more extreme assumptions to make the kind of the channels very clear, but there are many adjustments that you can make here that basically won't change the story. Now, so this is another. So we have a specific cost function for the supplier. This again can be generalized to some extent. But this will give us closed form solutions, which facilitate a bit. But the key here is that marginal costs will be increasing with quantity, and there is going to be a parameter omega, which is the inverse of productivity. So this will be basically something that the supplier is born with. And if you have a low omega, that means that for any given, so there are two things here. For the cost, so we have Q, which is the quantity, and there is I, which is investment, which is something that, so basically two stages in this production process. First, the supplier makes an investment, then he, in connection with the buyer, decides how much to produce. And the investment is such that it shifts down the marginal cost curve. So the more investment you have, the lower your marginal cost curve is going to be. In addition to that, you might be born high productivity, low omega firm, or a low productivity, high omega firm. And B tells you how effective investment is in terms of reducing production costs. Now, of course, investment also comes with a cost. So we have this quadratic cost. And the key here is that everybody knows that investment is good to reduce production costs later on, but this might be observable by the two parties, but it's not verifiable in a court. So you cannot really contract on that. So that's the incomplete contract dimension of the paper. The investment, the supplier has to make the investment trying to anticipate what's going to happen later, but that's basically it. The assumption here is simply to avoid investments that blow up, that are too big. And please stop me, anytime. We'll focus here on the case of dual sourcing. It has a particularly interesting implication that will be clear momentarily. So then we put some restrictions on the marginal cost and the price of the generics and a few other parameters. But clearly, what's important here is that there are some assumptions so that there is going to be some production of the specialized input. There's going to be some production and some sales of the generics. So each buyer will buy in equilibrium some generics and some specialized. And the buyer will want to do that because he wants to sell something. So there is basically some restrictions on V prime so that the buyer is interested in engaging in this production. So we'll start buying from the specialized, the generics, put it together, sell the final good. Timing. So in the first stage, each buyer will search for a supplier in either the foreign country or the rest of the world. Once the buyer has found a match and is satisfied with this match, they will then specialize towards each other, and then basically the rest of the game starts. For now, we basically, we leave that aside. I come back to the search part in the end of the presentation. So for now, let's just assume that the match has happened. When that happens, then as the supplier will make the relationship-specific investment. Once that's done, the two parties will bargain over price and quantity of Q. If bargaining is successful, and in equilibrium will always be successful, they will then trade Q units, payments are going to be made. After that, the buyer will decide how much generics he'll purchase. Final production happens, and final goods are sold. Efficient sourcing, or I actually should say privately optimal sourcing. Here it's quite simple. Basically, the total amount of inputs that the buyer will purchase is simply given by this expression. So, and nothing much will happen here. So we know how much in total the buyer will purchase. This will be a mix of the two, generics and specialized. And the third line is the line that gives basically the optimal sourcing strategy from the perspective of the firms. The marginal cost, given investment, given the level of efficiency or productivity of the supplier, marginal cost of producing QN units has to be equal to the marginal cost of buying generics. There is a tariff here, but the tariff affects both in the same way. So it basically doesn't affect the level of specialized inputs. Okay, so bargaining. S has chosen the investment, then the buyer and the seller have to discuss, determine the terms of trade, and that happens through generalized Nash bargaining. We say that the bargaining power of the seller is alpha, something strictly between 0 and 1. And they basically bargain over the bargaining surplus. So basically what they can do better relative to just not trading. If they don't trade, the seller doesn't get anything. The buyer simply buys generics only. If there is no PTA here, the only difference, and this bargaining again happens after investment has been made. So when so the bargaining surplus will be simply the difference, basically the cost savings between buying Q units from the specialized supplier relative to what you have to pay if you bought from the rest of the world generics. So I should also say that when here we can substitute one-to-one generics and and specialized inputs. But this is simply a normalization. You can normalize it, adjust price so that you have that.
I'm still confused, Manuel, about whether so are you assuming that the specialized inputs I can only get from foreign, so my PTA partner, and not from the rest of the world?
No, you can get from
both.
both.
You keep saying I'm getting from foreign the specialized. So this is,
Okay.
you can get it from anywhere.
They specialize?
Yeah,
anywhere. Yeah. I mean, we don't have a PTA here. So you are getting from everywhere, and then to this PTA, which was not announced, and then we'll see what happens. So the bargaining outcome, so basically then each one will get, like the seller, the supplier will get a fraction alpha of the bargaining surplus. The rest is kept by the buyer. So then in the investment stage, the seller, the supplier will choose investment to maximize its payoff, which is how much he gets of the bargaining surplus minus the cost of investment. You can, so this is basically the general condition. In the specific case we are looking at here, this is the expression. Observe that this is unaffected by the tariff. And again, it's not affected by the tariff because the tariff affects in the same way generics and specialized inputs. In terms of how much is going to be sold, and this is going to be always the case, it's going to be basically the quantity of specialized inputs will always be a proportion of how much has been invested. Yes.
I don't want to slow you down, but I'm really confused about the statement that you made a couple times about that the tariff has symmetric effects on the generic and the specialized inputs. I mean, that's very much contrary to the spirit of Antras and Steger. If I were to say the tariff is imposed on the selling price of the supplier's good, then the Nash bargaining outcome, if that price is determined by the bargaining, then the tariff will be applied to a different price of the specialized good and the generic.
I think the key thing here is that the tariff, it's not that the tariff doesn't have any impact here. The tariff will have an impact on the BQ. So basically the amount, this will be like the regular effects that you are used to. So it affects the composition, will affect the composition in the sense that if the tariff is lower, that means that you'll be buying more and therefore you're producing more, but that doesn't affect how much you produce in terms of how much you source in terms of specialized inputs. All the adjustment is in the generics part, which is the non-interesting part here.
I heard what you said, but I don't understand how that works.
Yeah.
Mathematically?
Well, are you imposing? What are you imposing with tariff?
Maybe there's going to be a picture coming up, and I think that will make it more clear. So that's, again, restating this. So the T will affect the BQ, which is not the interesting part here, but doesn't have any effect on how much you are sourced in terms of specialized inputs, and therefore also and how much the supplier is investing initially. Now, social welfare. So here, just thinking in terms of one single supplier or one single buyer and supplier, if we add up, basically the payoffs of the buyer, the supplier, as well as tariff revenue, if we solve for the efficient level of investment from the perspective of the world, you get a very similar expression, except that there is no alphas here. So basically the alphas, which is where the incomplete contract problems are kicking in, that's what's leading to inefficiency. Now, it's also good to notice here that the difference, basically the size of the inefficiency, so the difference between the efficient level of investment and the actual level of investment increases as omega falls. In other words, this contract incompleteness becomes more consequential for relationships that involve more productive suppliers. So let's put now a PTA here. So now the country, the home country signs a PTA with the foreign country. For the buyers, so before talking about search, the buyers that have matches in the rest of the world, they are unaffected by the PTA. They will be affected through this other channel because they will have an incentive to move locations. But for given matches, they are not affected. Now, if you are in foreign, and now there is an FTA, then things change. So basically, there is no tariffs now between the two. G will still be purchased from the rest of the world. They could buy some from the only thing that we couldn't have here, which make it more complicated, is if the home country bought everything, all generics from the foreign country. If there is still some coming from the rest of the world, same story follows. Sorry?
There's some cost in changing your matches once you've made them.
There will be a search cost. But everybody will be doing the best that they can initially, taking into account the search cost. But with the PTA, this will change. But just hold on for a moment. Now, because the T, which is now the external tariff, doesn't change, that also means that the total level of inputs that the supplier is purchasing doesn't change either. So in terms of Weinerian language here, this means that by construction, there's no trade creation. The traditional trade creation that you think about in a PTA does not arise here. So in a way, you can think about this as a model that is kind of geared towards the negative effects, or at least shutting down the typical positive effects of a PTA. So I'm not saying that there isn't. So of course you can allow that to happen here, but this is just to focus on a different aspect. All right, so what changes now in terms of the conditions for so again, it's not efficient, it's like privately optimal sourcing. The first two conditions are the same as before. Now this is different. And the difference is now that basically, from the perspective of the firms, the optimal is to buy QP such that the marginal cost of the supplier is equal to PW plus T. So basically the cost added by the tariff of generics. So basically that's basically what's changing the incentives to, as you see, to invest and to produce under the PTA. So now the bargaining surplus, we can do exactly the same type of analysis, get the optimal investment, and now there's going to be a T here. So basically, the key point is that now the supplier anticipates this additional payoff due to this protection relative to generic inputs. If we calculate the change in investment and the change in production from before the PTA to the PTA, they're both positive and both proportional to the tariff. So the higher this tariff, the greater is going to be the incentive to increase investment and therefore also to produce in the bargaining stage. None of these, we construct this, so none of these two changes are dependent on the initial level of productivity of the supplier. Bear that in mind. Now, this increase in Q, in the sourcing of specialized inputs, part of that is something that we know quite well, which is trade diversion. Well, let's call it sourcing diversion. So even if you didn't have any investment story, which would be equivalent here to the case where alpha is equal to 0, so the supplier never invests, even in that case, so you have more production simply because now it's cheaper to buy from within the FTA. Now, under the PTA, the investment will have a bigger impact on the bargaining surplus, simply because the expected and the actual level of production under the PTA for a given level of investment is going to be bigger than the analogous quantity without the PTA. The supplier will anticipate that. They anticipate that for any level of investment, it's going to be it's going to produce more and to earn more, and because of that, the supplier chooses to invest more, lowering the marginal cost curve. So with the PTA, now more units of specialized inputs should be traded. So we have basically three levels of Q here. The initial level of Q, the level of Q with the PTA, and there is something in between, which is what should have been produced under the PTA if we could eliminate this sourcing diversion. So basically you increase production for a good reason and for a bad reason. For a good reason is now that because you invested more, marginal costs are lower, so you should be producing more. On the other hand, you are taking advantage of this of the preference, and then there is sourcing diversion. So here maybe this helps a bit. So initially, so this is basically the demand. The V prime curve is the demand from the buyer. Initially, we have this higher curve, the marginal cost curve. And this is how much is produced initially, QN. So basically, initially, this is the area A is the bargaining surplus, so basically what they can gain by bargaining with each other. And this gives the supplier an incentive to invest, which gives you this initial curve. Now, with the PTA, if you capped initially the initial level of investment, you already know that you are going to get something bigger, which is area B, because now this is, you know that because of the preference, you want to trade these extra units. But anticipating this extra bargaining surplus, you invest more ex ante. So you bring down the marginal cost curve. So with the new marginal cost curve, the level of production in the end is going to be QPTA. Not that is good. So C is great. This area C is something good that is captured by the parties because now production costs have reduced. So the units that were produced before are produced now even more cheaply. So that's good. This area D is something that you should be getting. I mean, these extra units here, this should be produced under the FTA, given that marginal costs have been lowered. So that's good as well. But these extra units here, they shouldn't be there in this, from an efficiency point of view. This is basically sourcing diversion. It's more costly to buy specialized inputs here than to buy generics, but you do anyway, because from the perspective of the firms, that's the best they can do. I mean, because of the preference. Okay, so what are the welfare effects of the PTA here? So we have sort of a within relationship trade-off between classic trade diversion and what we call this investment enhancing effect. And again, by construction, there is no binarian trade creation in the trade of inputs. At the same time, there is nothing happening in the final goods markets as well. So we're shutting down those two channels. And then we have these two. This relationship strengthening effect and the sourcing diversion effect. The relationship strengthening effect is basically something that tells you that because you anticipate more units to be sold, you are going to invest more, and you, to some extent, mitigate this initial inefficiency that you are facing because of incomplete contracts. I should mention that this effect doesn't need to be positive. There could be excessive investment. There could be too much investment. But for relatively low levels of tariffs, this will be the case. And importantly here, all this effect change in a monotonic way with omega, meaning this relationship strengthening effect is more important for more productive firms, for firms that were initially more productive. And the reason here is simply that these low omega suppliers, these good suppliers, they produce more regardless at any trade regime. But therefore, when you increase investment, this has a bigger impact precisely when you're dealing with those guys. So the benefit of this cost savings will apply more to the suppliers who are high productivity. On the other hand, if you look at the sourcing diversion effect, that is unaffected by investment or the level of productivity. This is simply it's kind of a traditional deadweight loss sourcing or trade diversion type of inefficiency. So, still just considering a single relationship, you can then say that the PTA will enhance welfare if the supplier, thinking about just one partnership, only if the supplier is sufficiently productive. Because in that case, you know that this is the sourcing diversion is always going to be negative, but this could be positive enough. So this is going to be like a level of, which are calling omega hat, that beyond that, necessarily the FTA hurts welfare, but otherwise it improves things. You can also look at the effects of tariff preferences. In terms of the sourcing diversion effect, the higher the tariff, the worse it is. So it becomes more negative. For the relationship strengthening effect, then there is the relationship is a bit subtle. For the initially, it has a positive effect and increases because that's when you're boosting investment. Eventually, on the other hand, there might be too much investment, then that term becomes negative as well. So the welfare impact has basically an inverted U shape with respect to the external tariff. And the other thing that is important here is what we call the level of the Holdup problem. Here the idea is that the PTA is an imperfect substitute for these contractual imperfections. Now, if alpha is very low, meaning that basically the supplier doesn't have any incentive to invest, well, in that case, the PTA doesn't do much. It basically creates distortions in the sourcing decisions, and that's pretty much it, because it doesn't really boost investment. If you're in the other extreme, then it's the opposite. There's basically no contractual inefficiency to start with. Okay, so, and then you could have excessive investment. So it's basically for kind of moderate levels of alphas that the PTA could be useful. Okay, so what happens when you introduce search and match? So take all that, all that we have so far as given, and the buyer will be searching for a potential partner, either in the rest of the world or in the foreign country. Initially, the two countries are the same, so it doesn't really matter. The buyer will search as many times as he wants, but he has to pay a fixed cost, K, every time. So the payoff of the buyer finding when he searches and finds a certain supplier, the payoff will be the maximum of sticking with that guy or searching again. Well, then it's well known that in this kind of settings, there's going to be a cutoff rule such that you stop searching if you find a guy who is sufficiently good. So a cutoff rule like that, basically, basically, this is what you get when you get a guy that has exactly the level of productivity defined in the cutoff rule. This has to be equal to the benefit of keeping search, paying again the fixed cost of searching, and getting a new draw. If your draw is not so good, then you search again, and then this is what you get. And you can use equation 1 because you know that by construction the two are equal. If you get at someone who is very good, okay, then you will stop searching. You can then substitute this back to the initial equation, and you get that the payoff that you get with when you get exactly a supplier at the cutoff level is the expected gain from searching, provided that you get a good guy, minus the expected cost of finding a good guy. What happens with the PTA? Well, with the PTA is introduced, same kind of story, same kind of search process happens, except that now the cutoff rule, the cutoff is lower in the PTA, within the PTA, in the foreign country, than otherwise. Why is that? So there's a typo here. So basically, at the initial level of cutoff, the utility, the payoff of the buyer increase with the PTA for the reasons we just discussed. But the expected gains from keeping search increase even more, because then there is a likelihood that you might get a particularly good guy, and the PTA is especially good when you have a good match. So the key here is that the gain with the PTA rises with the productivity of the supplier, so as omega falls. So the benefit from searching for a great supplier increases with the PTA. So if we were matched initially in the foreign country, if your initial match was great, okay, so then you stop. Otherwise, if you are in this range, you go and you start searching again. Okay, it's finishing now. So suppose you are in the rest of the world. Then it's kind of the same story, except that now there is an extra incentive to search, because it's not just comparing what you have, what you have with the possibility of staying in the same regime with a better guy. It's also moving to a different trade regime. So here we have basically initially, this is the gain from keeping a match with productivity omega. This is the gain from keeping search. So this is the initial equilibrium. At that level, you introduce a PTA, the gains increase if you are in the foreign country, because now you have the preference. Now the gains from keeping search increase even more, and that's why the parallel shift is even bigger, which gives you a different level of cutoff level. If you were initially in the rest of the world, then the change is even bigger, because now you are comparing this function with this function. So all these guys who are here, they leave the rest of the world and go to the foreign country to search. So this is something that we have to do a bit more work. But basically, when you introduce search here, you essentially magnify the effects of the benefits of the PTA, especially conditional, especially when you're thinking about matches with higher productivity. Both go in the same direction. So just to complete then, so what the consequence of PTAs and the global sourcing, I think they can be quite different, and this is just one way of starting to analyze this. First, PTA can be welfare enhancing, even if you shut down. No, there should be trade creation, even if there is no traditional trade creation. The beneficial investment effect is especially large for high productivity supplies, because that's when the investment will have bigger implications. And the search and matching process just reinforce those effects and justify the view, as I was talking in the beginning, that the two things, PTAs and global value chains, go together. So just to finish, in this policy paper, Richard Baldwin was saying that now we have this new regionalism in the world of international fragmentations. We need to think about a different way of analyzing this. So what we're proposing here is kind of a blend between a different way, but also using the traditional Weinerian view, which we think is still useful in this context if you adapt it enough.
I'll refrain myself. So Paul, you're... let's say a couple of minutes, because I don't want to be also unfair to Emmanuel, but we have some constraint on the time on the panelists. So,
I mean, the way my main comment is that the way I understand it, it's sort of you're building on your previous work, adding a third country, but you're emphasizing this investment enhancing effects of trade liberalization, which is interesting. But once you look at a PTA, I thought you would have tried to see whether the fact that there's suppliers in a third country might lead to a qualification of that result. I can imagine situations where I sign a PTA and that sort of messes up the bargaining between alternative potential suppliers in a way that protects some and actually aggravates certain types of underinvestment. And sort of thinking about exactly in which situations you're actually going to get enhanced investment and in which circumstances you wouldn't, that would seem like a...
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, I think there are many dimensions which we could go here. One is, trying to relate the third market is through search. Basically, this changing changing locations as a result of the PTA because of not just changing locations precisely, for those guys who are looking for better matches, which is. Those are exactly the ones who give you the big boost in the PTA. So that's the dimension we are exploring now.
As I say, I keep mine for later. So maybe so we can. So that's a round of applause.